You're listening to Stealing from Wizards, Volume 2, Burglary, by R.A. Consul. Chapter 11. Promises. Having his bag, room, and person searched for stolen goods was insulting. It was embarrassing, and it was starting to get annoying. The second burglary happened while Kuro was out in the Blandlands visiting Danny, the bird lady, and his old cat, Gray. He'd had a lovely time drinking tea, petting the cat, sharing stories about birds, and politely refusing the books she insisted on giving him. He returned from a delightful evening to find Flint waiting for him at the lodge, looking grim and annoyed at Kuro's late return. While Danny was able to account for an hour of Kuro's missing time, she couldn't vouch for the time he had spent traveling. He was again searched, and he was given detention for being out in the Blandlands. The third burglary happened while Kuro was serving his detention. Flint and Kuro had established a bond of trust the year prior with all the time they had spent together. So Flint allowed Kuro to shelve some books alone in the library on a Sunday afternoon, and he finished his duties to find a frustrated Flint storming up the stairs, accompanied by another baseless accusation for which Kuro had an inadequate alibi. The fourth burglary happened while Kuro was tied to a tree. One dreary afternoon, while Kuro was practicing his summoning in the safety of an open space, he was assaulted by the Avalon Royal Defense League. Moira and Azalea attacked him from two sides of the meadow in which he was practicing. Moira accused him of villainy while conjuring a barricade of ice to block his escape, and Azalea grinned menacingly as she hurled balls of flame. He ran, as was tradition for these meetings, but this time they had prepared a net into which they corralled him. He was captured, bound to a tree, and abandoned in the autumn drizzle. It took him over an hour to wriggle free of the bonds, and when he finally made it back to the lodge, he found Flint waiting for him, his room having already been turned inside out. By the fifth, Kuro didn't even ask why he'd been called into Flint's office anymore. He just dumped his bag on Flint's desk, emptied his pockets, and left. Flint, for his part, didn't enjoy the routine any more than Kuro. It was an incredible waste of time, which would have been better spent looking for the actual burglar. Unfortunately, everyone at school knew that Kuro was a notorious criminal, and so every victim accused him personally. As they were all children of terribly important people, Flint had no choice but to perform his pointless due diligence and pull Kuro in for another round of inspections. Kuro's efforts to be an unremarkable and ordinary student had been entirely undone as he was once again the center of attention at the school. The ordeal was somewhat better than the previous year, when the thefts had made him an outcast. This time he had defenders, people who refused to believe that such a successful and elusive criminal as the Winking Weasel would be so sloppy as to consistently leave huge messes at the scene of the crime. Those same defenders, however, still paid Kuro more attention than he wanted. Kuro wanted nothing to do with the burglaries. He didn't know anything and didn't want to know anything. He really needed to focus on his schoolwork if he was going to pass any courses, and yet he was constantly being dragged in to consult on the wild theories being thrown around by his schoolmates. Charlie and Arthur were the worst speculators at the school. Charlie was prone to flights of fancy so elaborate that she could spend an entire evening expounding enthusiastically on the various impossibilities involved in her hypotheses. Nothing was too absurd for her. If her ideas required a dragon queen to team up with ninja pixies and engage in time travel, that was fine with her, regardless of whether any of those things existed. Arthur was much less fanciful with his inquiries. His father was a great detective, and so Arthur knew about evidence and such things. He had a neatly organized notebook in which he detailed the various clues he collected regarding times, dates, locations, and the movements of various people he considered to be suspects. That list continually grew longer as Arthur learned the names of more people. Neither friend would give Kuro a moment's peace, as they couldn't imagine not wanting to be involved in solving the mystery. What if instead of the window, the burglar cut a hole in the ceiling to get in and then replaced it when they left? Proposed Charlie. Have you ever done anything like that, Kuro? Kuro looked to Marie for help, but she was quite successfully doing her work despite the noise. A lifetime in a house full of siblings had trained her to ignore the inane ramblings of the people around her. Veronique Archambault was out of her room for less than 10 minutes, observed Arthur, pen poised to add information. How would you have gotten in and out in that time? Kuro did not answer. Instead, he tried to follow Marie's lead. He buried his face in his books and tried to force the words he was looking at to drown out his friends. Why do you think it's only first years that have been burgled so far? Demanded Charlie, her eyes peeking over the top of Kuro's textbook. Do you think one of them has a secret key to the labyrinth beneath the island which holds the Sword of Lords that can only be drawn by the true king of the fairy realm? And the burglar is secretly the lost summer prince who needs that key so he can draw the sword and claim the rightful place on the throne? Is that who you really are, Kuro Hayashi? Charlie was a monster. She knew Kuro couldn't resist that onslaught of absurdity, especially not after accusing him of being both the burglar and a prince. Not to mention having the audacity to use his full name as though it meant something. He slammed his book closed and tried very hard to stifle his laughter. I really need to get this done, he pleaded. I'm not like you guys. I'll fail if I don't do my work. I may fail if I do my work. And then I really will have to start burgling people again. His friends relented for the moment. Out of consideration for their embattled friend, they removed him from the conversation and instead debated loudly between themselves as to whether vampires or ghosts were more likely suspects, and whether anyone in Autumn Lodge would ever be targeted. While he had trouble ignoring his friends, Kuro was well practiced at ignoring the crimes of other people. His life in Detritus Lane had taught him well to leave others to their work. There was sort of an unspoken code of honor among thieves, born not out of respect, but out of a system of self-preservation. Interfering with another theft has a way of getting both parties caught, and knowing too much could make one a person of interest to the guard. Kuro knew the other thieves around Detritus by their habits rather than their faces. A large rat lounging on the steps of a residence, a house with a second-story window forced open, a shabby man standing by a lamppost in the pre-dawn hours. Those were telltale signs of a thief at work, and a collegial warning for others to stay away. Kuro's professional incuriosity made the school thefts particularly easy to ignore. They were sloppy, boring, and harmless. The thief, or thieves, made a terrible mess and barely took anything. To date, all that had gone missing were 2 hairbrushes, a pair of shoes, a parasol, and a mirror. All expensive and fancy ones, to be sure, but nothing substantial, nothing those students and their wealthy families couldn't casually replace. And nothing particularly personal. The fact that Kuro didn't have a decent alibi wasn't particularly notable, given that almost nobody had one. All the crimes happened when people were in transition, between classes or around meals, when most of the students were moving from one place to another. Kuro dismissed it all as more student antics, inspired by the foolishness of the year before, and perpetrated against first years because they would be the least able to defend themselves against a largely incompetent thief. Kuro settled in and ground through a good chunk of his Gaelic homework before he was inevitably distracted by Charlie and Arthur again. He had gotten used to the rhythm of their constant, uneven chatter, with Charlie's loud, excited monologues occasionally punctuated by brief, monotone observations from Arthur. But their conversation had accidentally veered towards something that mattered and hit a bump. "How's your sludge hunt going?" asked Charlie. The unfamiliar silence that followed drew Kuro away from his notes. He looked up to find that Arthur had blanched at the question. He'd gone so pale his skin had become transparent and his eyes retreated a good way into his skull. "Fine," he said. "Are you having trouble finding it?" asked Marie. "You know we would help you." "I think I found it, but..." Arthur paused to choose his words. "I'm having trouble collecting it." "That's not hard," encouraged Kuro. Just make sure you use a wooden spoon. It'll give you a good zap if you use a metal one." The others looked at Kuro quizzically. "I used to scrape that stuff out of the sewer tunnels for potions I had to make for... somebody." Kuro still couldn't say Phineas's name, and he was grateful that his friends understood. "It's not the worst thing I've collected. Not quite, anyway." "Thanks, but that's not the problem." Arthur squirmed a little and flushed with embarrassment. "I don't like the dark." Charlie slapped Arthur on the shoulder. "I wouldn't have guessed you were afraid of the dark, but that's fine. You're good at light evocations." That was true, but Kuro wondered if it might be the reason Arthur was so good at making lights. It didn't matter in this situation, though. Charlie didn't know about luminous slime mold, but a meaningful glance from Arthur told Kuro that he did. Luminous slime mold is thin, transparent, and indistinguishable from damp rock, which makes it particularly tricky to find given that it likes to live on damp rocks. The only way to find it is when it glows, and it only glows in the dark. To find it, you need to hang out, still and silent, usually at night, in the absolute pitch darkness for up to an hour before it starts to glow. I can get it for you, said Kuro. I couldn't let you do that. It's my responsibility, Arthur said, as though he really hoped Kuro would insist. It's okay. It's no trouble. You did the hard work of figuring out where it is. All I'm doing is scraping it into a jar. Besides, Charlie and Marie helped me find the Night Raven. It's only right that I help you out. Arthur glowed with relief. I'm not going to help write the report, though. That evening, Arthur led Kuro to a limestone protrusion near the Summer Quarter cliffs. It was a small mound with an opening on it, tiny enough that even Kuro would have to worm his way in on his belly. There was also evidence that Arthur had found it some time ago. A line of clover on the ground looked like it had been worn down from somebody pacing back and forth on it. You really don't mind? Arthur asked yet again. Oh, not at all. The dark doesn't bother me. Kuro found he was looking forward to it. I'm not afraid of it, you know, Arthur said, though he fidgeted and fretted just looking into the hole. It's just that I don't know who I am in the dark. Like, what do I look like when I can't be seen? What if it's bad? Kuro knew Arthur had similar anxieties about sleeping. He always drew the curtains around his bunk whenever he slept, and kept a fairy light in bed with him. Do you need me to make a light for you? Arthur asked as Kuro readied himself for a good crawl. It's okay, I can do it. Kuro conjured a little glowing orb. It was faint and unstable, but good enough to see in a small dark cave. A good light would make the slime mold take longer to glow anyway. Kuro wormed his way inside, his little light illuminating a long, snaking tunnel. After a good distance, the cave opened into a chamber tall enough for Kuro to stand and stretch in. It was cool and damp in the way that only the underground can be, where the air, the rock, the water felt as though they had been unchanged and in the same place, at the same temperature, for eons. It was utterly dark and ominously quiet. If Kuro quieted his breath, he could hear his own pulse in his ears. He had a hard time understanding Arthur's discomfort with the dark. Kuro felt more himself in the cave. There were no eyes on him, nobody accusing him or judging him, no demands or expectations. The school uniform meant nothing in the dark. He didn't have to pretend to belong in it. He was invisible and alone. He felt the tension in his shoulders that he didn't even know he carried relax as he settled down into the damp rock for a long, peaceful, and painfully uncomfortable wait. It was even better than the night in the tree. He sat appreciating the silence and the solitude while the cold of the cave slowly crept up through his bottom, gently numbing him. Slowly, a faint blue-green glow started to fill the cave. Not enough to see by, but enough to start to make out the forking tendrils of the slime mold he'd been sent to fetch. He was in no hurry. The mold would get a little brighter, and it would be easier to find the best bits to scrape off, though it looked like someone had already done so. There were sharp lines where the mold suddenly ended. Kuro examined the work. It was sloppy in his estimation. Too much had been taken at the edges. That was a mistake he'd made early on, gathering ingredients for Phineas. He supposed some of the older students must have to gather the mold for alchemy work as well, though he was surprised they could fit into the cave. It would be a tight squeeze for many of his classmates, let alone a high schooler. As he waited, a wavering in the dull light caught his attention. A patch of the mold had gone dark. Or rather, Kuro thought it had. It was so nearly black that he wondered if it was his imagination. Regardless, he reached out to touch the spot where it had been, only to find his approach blocked by a warm, fleshy mass that screamed like a squirrel with its tail on fire. And then the cave was gone, and Kuro was somewhere else. Sudden isn't a strong enough word for the transition. Transition might be too strong a word as well. Kuro was in a cave, and then he was not. There wasn't a step or a blink or a pop to mark the movement. Kuro had stayed still while the world changed around him. He was overcome by a horrible sensation of not having moved. The sickening lurch that should accompany a sudden, unexpected shift in position was uncomfortably absent, and it left a hollow void in its place. Each of his senses, in their turn, agreed that he was not at all where he had been, and that he had gotten there in an entirely improper manner, and that they were ardent in their opposition to the whole affair. The place he found himself appeared to be a storage room for alchemy supplies. It was small, lit only by a single oil lamp, and empty except for himself and a creature he had surprised in the cave, whom Kuro could now see was a tiny Luten. He was young, his beard barely a patchy goatee, and his nose and ears were still much too big for his head. He dressed in oversized brown overalls, which slouched over his boots, and a muddy blue shirt. The little Luten was shaking from the surprise of being grabbed in the cave and took a moment to calm his breathing. It was only a moment, though. After letting out most of a sigh, he noticed that Kuro was still holding onto his elbow. He squeaked in panic, and then the world turned inside out again. They appeared in a snowy glade with a few small stone buildings. Kuro almost had time to sort out which way was up before the world shifted again, and they were on top of the junior high, then under a growth of elephant ferns in the swamp, then a bedroom, a kitchen, a tool shed, a tree stump. Each flip lasted less than a second, and each was punctuated by a startled cry from the Luten. Pop, squeak, pop, squeak, pop, squeak. It was disorienting to the point of nausea, and while his body was flitting about like sunlight off waves, his brain felt like it was taking the normal overland route. The rapid slideshow of locations thankfully ceased. The Luten instead tried to squirm free of Kuro's grasp. Kuro nearly did release his accidental captive. He had started to loosen his grip, which had become quite tight during the unsettling transitions, and to apologize for surprising the Luten. He hesitated, though, as he noticed where they were. They were standing on a rock in the middle of a lake. It was bare except for some aggressive lichens whose spindly masses reached out towards the invaders, eager for the nourishment they could provide. While even the most predatory of lichen could be outrun at a slow walk, being trapped on a boulder with a colony of the stuff surrounded by water when Kuro didn't know how to swim was going to eventually be quite fatal. If he let go and the Luten left, he'd be stuck. "I'm sorry for surprising you, but could you bring me back to the dark cave with the mold?" he asked as politely as he could. That was when the Luten really looked at Kuro for the first time. As he took in the features of his captor, a slow horror crept over his face. His eyes went wide and his mouth opened in a scream that took several seconds to find its voice. The cry that eventually emerged was an ear-piercing shriek that would put a banshee to shame, lasting until the Luten had run out of breath. Once that had subsided, a panicked flurry of legs and arms thrashed about, trying to escape from the horror that was Kuro.
"Help!"
he shouted.
"The Kuro monster has me! It's going to eat me!"
"I'm not gonna eat you," Kuro said in as soothing a tone as he could, though any assurance he gave was weakened by the fact that he refused to loosen his grip.
"Yes, it will! The Kuro monster eats Luten children to steal their powers!"
The recent behavior of the other Luten towards Kuro crystallized in that moment. Their caution around him since returning from summer break, their unwillingness to talk to him, his mail not being delivered, it all made sense if they thought he was some sort of predator. He wasn't even sure they were wrong. Kuro was part Luten, but he didn't know which part or how it got there. Maybe he had eaten Luten children back before he could remember. Maybe Phineas had taken those memories from him. That was the sort of thing Phineas would do. Kuro let the terrified Luten go. It wasn't a well-considered decision, but he felt too guilty at the possibility of the claims to monsterhood being true to hold on with any strength. Free from the grip, the Luten scrambled away across the rock and raised the wooden spoon he'd brought for mold scraping like a sword in preparation to fight off the dangerous creature who was the Kuro monster. The two stared at each other until the silence became awkward. "Aren't you gonna leave?" Kuro asked at last.
"You will follow me and eat me,"
the Luten asserted.
"I will fight you here."
"I can't follow you," Kuro said. "I don't know how."
"You are lying. You followed me here."
The Luten backed up to the edge of the boulder so that Kuro couldn't possibly get around behind him. He was ready to fight for his life.
"You won't trick me."
"I didn't follow you. You brought me," Kuro repeated. The Luten didn't believe Kuro. Not that Kuro could blame him. The Luten had every reason to distrust the Kuro monster. As Kuro continued to stand still, however, his hands in his pockets, gently nudging away any carnivorous lichen patches that inched too close to him, a glimmer of doubt settled into the Luten's resolute posture. All it took was that flicker of uncertainty, and the Luten was gone, vanished from the spot, leaving Kuro alone in the middle of a troublingly large lake. Kuro kicked himself for his sympathy. He could have held on and threatened the Luten until he'd been brought back to Avalon, and then he'd let the child go. It wouldn't have made much difference to the Luten. He'd already been assaulted by a terrifying Luten-eating monster. A couple of empty threats wouldn't have made his day much worse. Kuro started weighing his options for escape. The nearest shore was close enough that he could discern a dock with a small boat. He even thought he could see someone standing on it. He might have a chance at rescue. Kuro shouted and waved, trying to get the person's attention. They didn't seem to notice him, or even move. He squinted and shielded his eyes, trying to block out the sun flickering off the ripples on the lake. Either the dock was very large or the person was very small. Also, they looked like they were holding a weapon. Kuro's moment of optimism evaporated. It was the Luton, watching him, making sure Kuro didn't get the drop on him. Kuro crouched down and tested the water. There were a few underwater boulders nearby, but they fell away quickly into a silty darkness. He couldn't tell how deep it was, but it really didn't matter whether he drowned in 10 feet or 100. He was distracted from his worries about drowning by some motion in the water. Out in the middle of the lake, a long serpentine form crested the surface, its spiny fin shining like a rainbow in the sunlight. It took several seconds for its full length to slide past.
What are you doing?
The accusing question from behind him startled Kuro, and he lost his footing, slipping gracelessly into the lake. He scrambled for a handhold, but found only masses of lichen that came away from the rocks and clung eagerly to his hands. He struggled to find footing on the slippery, submerged rocks in the water, while trying to avoid inhaling too much of the lake and scraping off his new carnivorous mittens.
Why didn't you follow me?
The Luton demanded, failing to show any sympathy for Kuro's plight. I can't. Kuro could only speak one word at a time as he had to hop on the underwater rocks to get his mouth to clear the water.
Why are you in the water?
The tone of the questions implied that this was all some part of Kuro's devious plan to eat the Luton child. I slipped, Kuro said, taking a new breath with each hop and holding it as his mouth went back underwater.
Why are you hopping on a rock?
I can't swim.
Then the pogo will eat you.
Then would you please help me? Kuro bobbed impatiently as the little Luton considered the request. He had a terrible monster at his mercy. All he had to do was wait, and the Kuro monster would be eaten in what must seem like a just twist of fate. But the Luton wavered. Perhaps Kuro was failing to live up to his legendary monstrousness. Or maybe the Luton just wasn't ready to be responsible for somebody's death, even if it was deserved. Cautiously, the Luton reached out his wooden spoon to Kuro, ready to drop it and vanish if Kuro made any sudden moves. Kuro grasped it gently, not wanting to startle his rescuer, who hauled on the spoon to pull Kuro within reach of a clear patch of the boulder. Kuro dragged himself out, heavy from the soaking uniform, and took several long breaths. Thank you, he said to the Luton.
You are not a very good monster,
he replied. Kuro sighed. It was yet another thing to add to his lengthy list of incompetencies. No, I'm probably not. The autumn air, wherever they were, was chilly and cut through his wet clothes. I suppose it would be too much to ask for you to bring me back to the cave on Avalon. The Luton looked at Kuro with intense suspicion.
You will eat me.
Kuro groaned in frustration. I promise I won't eat you. I just don't want to be stuck on this rock waiting to get eaten myself. Something about that stirred a change in the Luton. He was still wary, but less tense.
You would make a promise?
Of course, Kuro replied, though there was something odd in the way the Luton had said the word promise. There was a weight to it.
A real promise. A fairy promise. Not a wizard promise.
It was a half question and half accusation. Kuro began to understand. He was familiar with wizard promises. They were given out freely and abandoned at the slightest sign of trouble. At best, they were honest claims of good intentions, and in Kuro's experience, wizards were rarely at their best. I think wizard promises are the only ones I know how to make, he apologized. The Luton scowled at the revelation and managed to lower his opinion of Kuro even further.
I will show you, and you will promise. You will promise not to eat Luton anymore.
Is that all? Kuro agreed a bit too eagerly. The Luton paused and considered his terms.
No,
he said, realizing the power he had over Kuro.
You will promise to protect Luton instead. And you will promise to teach me wizard magic. And to get me chocolate. And to not tell.
Kuro cringed. I can try to get you chocolate, but I can't get it very often either. Also, I'm worse at magic than I am at being a monster.
I do not care. You will promise or I will leave you here and the pogo will eat you.
Okay, just tell me how to do it. The Lutin became deadly serious.
It is old magic. It is names and blood and truth.
How much blood? Kuro worried that he'd gotten himself into a problem just as big as the water serpent in the lake. The Lutin shook his head at the folly of wizards.
It does not matter. It matters that it is yours and that you will give it to the promise. Shed your blood, say our names, and make your promise. That is all. If it is true, then it is done.
It seemed much too simple. All the magic Kuro knew that could do anything powerful involved rituals and chants in strange languages, and often lots of drawing in chalk and ash. If it would convince the Lutin to bring him back to Avalon, though, it was worth trying. Kuro chipped the edge of the jar he had that was meant for gathering slime mold, and slit his thumb a little on the edge. It was shallow, but a thin line of blood appeared. The Lutin nodded in approval, but Kuro hesitated. I don't know your name.
I am Bindle,
said the Lutin proudly.
Now say your promise to me.
I, Kuro, promise you, Bindle, that I will never eat a Lutin. Kuro knew right away why Bindle had said the word promise with such force and respect. The moment Kuro said it, it was true. It had been true before, but now Kuro knew that it had to stay true forever. He had promised. It was a feeling he knew, but from an entirely different source. It was like the magic Phineas had used to bind Kuro into his service. But instead of having the chains forced on him, Kuro had put them on himself. He could no more break the promise than disobey his old master, but at the same time it was entirely different. The magic that had compelled Kuro to follow his master's orders had been almost a forgery of this one. It had been made of the same parts, but dissected and reassembled to create a twisted copy of the original. He continued the promises as Bindle instructed, each tying him to the words he said, or more, the intentions behind them, all but the promise to teach wizard magic. He could not make that promise. He tried, but he didn't believe that he could do it. And so the truth wasn't there. The best he could do was promise to try. Bindle the Lutin was enormously satisfied with his victory over the Kuro monster. In his mind, he had not only defeated a giant, but subjugated it as well. He was almost eager to take Kuro back to the cave on Avalon to prove that he had tamed the beast. Kuro held onto Bindle's elbow, and despite Bindle's insistence that it was impossible and not at all how anything worked, Kuro was again pulled along as Bindle blinked between places. The world spun while they stood still. The bright sun and the lake winked out, and they were engulfed in darkness. Slowly, Kuro's eyes adjusted to the darkness of the cave and the dim blue light of the slime mold. As they filled their jars with luminous sludge, Kuro instructed Bindle on the proper way to do it. It wasn't that he thought Bindle needed the instruction, but he couldn't help trying to teach him the way that wizards did it. He had made a promise. When both had enough for their purposes, Bindle vanished, and Kuro crawled out of the cave. As he exited, he was greeted by Arthur, waiting patiently in his pacing rut. He looked at Kuro, cocked his head, and asked, "Why are you all wet?" Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast, or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.